then it's not like we don't want casinos in Oklahoma. That includes a giant Indian casino. Like we would not want that.
Their own laws too.
Some of them do. Yeah.
Some of them like they can operate.
Some of it they get like the Seminole Indians in South Florida tried to give the state of Florida an exemption that would let them violate the state's gambling law to build casinos because you can't have casinos in Florida.
Right.
And so they asked for an exemption. And a lot of states out west is the same thing. You can't operate a casino unless it's these Indians. But it's sort of one of those things where when the Indians are like, what are we supposed to do, right? Like we have this little patch of desert, so give it, and it's like, well, I don't want you to build a casino, but we also don't want to tell you to, right? And then you end up with wonderful problems where if everyone in the tribe is allowed a percentage of the take from the casino, all of a sudden membership in the tribe becomes a huge deal. And so all of a sudden people are like, well, I'm 197 Cherokee, so like I'm gonna need 1/100% of the money, and then they have to start deciding, like they have to do genealogy and stuff. The Supreme Court case was about people who had been owned as slaves by the Cherokee, and when slavery was banned, the Cherokee just cut those people loose. But now they claim that because they were owned, they deserve by the Cherokee, they deserve a piece of the Cherokee's money because they're not doing so bad these days. The Supreme Court said that's fine. They should be able to claim status as members of the Cherokee tribe nation, even if they're not, even if they were slaves owned by the Cherokee. And so these are obviously problems that nobody ever really thought was going to be a thing, right? And so, of course, there's also the story in the 20th century, the U.S. military used Indians as code breakers, Comanche Indians and Navajo Indians, although the Comanche usually get in the movies. Because the Japanese never figured out that the weird code they were hearing over the radios in the South Pacific was not a code, it was simply Navajo people talking to each other. There was no way they would have known that, right? And so, again, it's somewhat sad and very tragic that it sort of ended this way. But again, if you go back to the first half of this class, this isn't an innovation or a surprise. This is the way that the settlers, the first Europeans in the continent, had interacted with Indians basically since the 14 and 1500s, right? The difference, of course, is that if anything, the imbalance between Indians and settlers in the 19th century is more, right? Now it's not people running around the woods with muskets. Now it's the full force of the U.S. military against the Indians, and the results are fairly predictable, right? And so that is as they say that, right? So yeah.
So didn't the American government try to be reasonable with the Indians, where they took their land still, but they could still farm and make money?
In some cases yes, and in some cases no. Depends on who and when you're talking about, because lots of different Indians, lots of different time. Sometimes they would say that, and then they would abruptly decide later that they would not do that, right? And so in the 1830s, when the Jackson administration moved out, there was the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Seminole and a couple others. They had actually had treaties to that effect with the Indians. We're like, well, we're gonna take some of your land, but then we're gonna guarantee the rest of it, and we're gonna try to set up businesses where you can make money and farming and stuff. And then the Jackson administration abruptly decided that it wanted that farmland for distribution to white settlers, so we're just gonna ignore those treaties. And of course, when the Cherokee were like, well, wait a minute, we have this agreement, the Jackson administration was like, I didn't sign that, so I don't really give a shit. And that was why in the 1880s, when the government comes in with, in the 1870s, when they come in with treaties, well, we can sign a treaty. The Indians are like, well, no, because you guys you'll break them, right? And even when we convinced the Indians to go on reservations with the promise of payment, the Indians would reasonably say, look, all we know how to do is hunt buffalo. So if we're going to go on a reservation and learn how to be farmers, we don't have the first clue how to do that. And the government was like, well, it's fine. We'll send some guys to teach you, and we'll pay you, and we'll give you cash for a few years to get you going. Most of the time, we would break those agreements too. And so there comes a point, I think, in the 1870s and 80s where most Indians would suspect that if the government is going to offer you something, they're just lying. Basically, they would say whatever to get you to give up the land, and then once you're off the land, well, then who cares, right? They're just going to dump you in a reservation somewhere, and if you issue a peep, you get met with the Union, the U.S. military, right?
Yeah, didn't they threaten them to if you didn't farm, then you just go to jail?
I mean, if you don't, we're not paying you, so if you don't farm, I guess you'll starve, and anything you do that's not farming, we will interpret as a crime, right? Yeah. And so, a couple times the Comanche would go raid for food because they don't have food, and the government would be like, well, we told you not to do that. And they're like, well, we're starving. And it's like, yeah, but you attacked this guy's farm, and you killed a bunch of his cows, so you're a bunch of thieves, And so the Indians would be put in a possible position, stay on the reservation and die of starvation, or goes raid for the food that you need, and then be branded as criminals and then hung, right? And so yeah, you put them in a situation where they basically have no choice. Even the thing that we supposedly want them to do, we don't really give them any ability to do that thing, And so you can understand exactly why, come the 20th century, if you're a Native American kid, you learn all this in school, you think this is awful, these are people who just like me, and they got treated like, you know, not even second-class citizens, like less than that, right? And that's one of those things where the whole story of 19th century America is like, let's settle the Great Plains and let's like fill in all the gaps and go west, young man. And yeah, I mean that's great, except the backdrop to that is the sort of the other thing that had to happen too, right? Which is about as bad as you can really make it out to be. And I mean, in some cases it really was war. The Apache and the Comanche did their fair share of bad things too, right? I mean, nobody's going to defend guys who got a kick out of scalping people. But on the other hand, you know, like in some cases we ended up rounding up and shooting women and children too, right? And so there's not really a way to sugarcoat that, I guess. But yeah, the other thing about the Indian Wars is, you know, I gave you the story about the Sioux, but there's lots and lots of Indian groups, all of whom get dealt with in different ways, right? Like some of the Indians, like the Tonkawa, for example, they were happy to work for the government for years, and they did. The government paid them, and it was fine. Other groups of Indians didn't get dealt with so fairly as that. If that makes sense. Yeah. And that had always been the problem for, of course, anybody living in the United States. We're going back to the 1600s. The very first problems that you had in Jamestown were over Indians, right? So I mean, it's not this in a sense. It's not a new story. It's an old one, right? So having said that, let's now talk about something completely different. And so we talked a little about the West. We talked a little bit about the South, a bunch about the South. Let's talk about the North, and let's talk about the development of the economy, which is, as it turns out, staggeringly significant, but also in some respects really boring. So the big story that goes on in late 19th century America is primarily one of economic development. This is the thing that's been humming along for a few years before the Civil War. It goes into overdrive during the Civil War, and then goes even larger, further into overdrive after the Civil War. And so this is the Industrial Revolution, particularly in the United States of America. And of course, just like everything, the Industrial Revolution, we didn't invent it, but we did it bigger and louder than anyone else did it, right? Other than China, who's done it, it turns out bigger and louder than we did. And so they had some time to learn about how to do it, right? And so on the one hand, this is some economics that we're going to talk about. I appreciate that economics is profoundly boring, and there's literally nothing that can be more dull than someone speaking about economics. On the other hand, it's actually a tragedy that has to be the case, because economics is significantly important, as it turns out. Probably the most important thing that all of us run our lives by, but none of us learn anything about in school. And so we'll try to make the economics parts of it somewhat less painful, but we need to discuss it, right? So the Industrial Revolution, it originated in England in the late 1700s. The British government and the British society, the British economy, they had this sort of magical moment where a number of factors came together, and the economy of England just exploded in size. There's a whole bunch of things going on. Lots of raw materials coming in from the British colonies. They had a huge population of people who could work. They had a number of very, very, very important technological developments all at the same time. Things like the steam engine, and things like the idea of the factory. The idea that instead of people making things by hand in their homes, you would gather everything together in a building, and somebody would own the building and pay people to come make things in the building using machines that he owned. Which is probably one of the most significant ideas in the history of humanity. And so all those things sort of happened at just the right time. And as a result, what you got was this huge explosion of economic growth in England. And so it was perhaps the defining element of 17 and 1800s English society. All these people from rural England flooded into the big cities, were crammed into apartment buildings, tenements. They went to work in giant factories. Some of them suffered quite terribly, but on the end, the economy totally changed, right? Farming ceased to become the dominant economic activity. Even if a lot of people farmed, it was not very important economically. And at the same time, whole legions of new items, products, began to be mass-produced so cheaply that literally anybody could buy them. Anybody could buy clean clothes. New clothes were things that were so expensive during the Middle Ages. People sometimes would get one pair of clothing per year, if that. And now anybody could just go to a store and there'd just be racks and racks and racks of shirts and pants and socks and whatever you wanted, you could just buy. And furniture and all sorts of things. And so this is the process that we're sort of talking about in 19th century America, right? It's the same sort of change that happens, right? And as you might imagine, the technology is a little different because you're talking about 80 years later, right? But the effect is basically the same. In 1861, most Americans worked on a farm. In 1900, most Americans worked in a factory. And so in the 20th century, we hit the tip-off point where more people in the United States of America lived in a city than not in a city. A couple years ago, we hit the tip-off point where more people in the planet Earth lived in a city than lived not in a city. So it took a while to get that last one right. And so there's a few things that happen. First, the amount of things produced goes up dramatically. It makes sense, right? You start building factories, you make more shit. Right? You can make way more pots and pans in a pot making machine than you can with a guy banging on a forge, right? So that makes sense. On the other hand, the amount of goods produced per worker, what economists call productivity, skyrockets. The amount of effort it takes to make an item goes way down, and the amount a worker can produce goes way up. What this means is when you get more and more and more people working in factories, you can get more and more and more stuff, right? And all of a sudden, stuff becomes cheap. And so we live in a world today where stuff is incredibly inexpensive because we have plastic, and plastic in China. And so you can go to Target, you go to Walmart, you can buy literally anything you want for relatively limited amounts of money, whether it's cooking implements, clothes, electronics, housewares, furniture, whatever. In the early 19th century, in the 18th and 20s, stuff is expensive. If you're going to buy a piece of furniture, somebody had to make that, and they had to make it by hand. And every one of those things was unique, right? The design might be common, but every single one had little quirks and things. By the early 20th century, stuff is beginning to be so cheap because you just go get it mass produced, right? You can go get pots, pans, cookware, plates, cups, bowls, knives, forks, dishes, clothing. All of it's made in a factory. We associate homemade, handmade objects with high quality because obviously today in the mass-produced world that we live in, if someone takes the time to make something by hand, then presumably they're good at it, and you have to pay more to get it, which means it's a better object. But in the early 20th century, mass-produced things were great. They were all the same. The quality was assured. You could pull a shirt off the rack and know that it was going to look exactly like all the other ones. And that was, people wanted that. That was great. And particularly middle class and lower middle class people finally had the ability to afford large amounts of stuff that they never had the ability to afford before, right? Now, the trade-off, of course, is that there are some issues to be had here. The big issue that the British discovered in the late 1700s, 1800s is that when you cram everybody together in big cities, there are problems. Public health becomes a problem, crime becomes a problem, immigration, as people rush in to get these jobs, becomes an issue that people had never really thought about before. And so immigration never came up in the Middle Ages unless we were talking about Genghis Khan immigrating his army to your base. On the other hand, now all of a sudden you have these worries about huge numbers of people from other countries coming in and taking jobs. That had been a thing that never really had occurred before, right? It was not a concern before. And on top of that, you had the problem Karl Marx correctly identified as the core problem of modern capitalism. Not everybody's going to get rich the same amount. Everybody's going to work hard, but because of the way the system is set up, some people who end up owning the factories end up working, maybe as hard as the people who work in the factory, but the resources don't get shared equally between those two groups of people, and that makes people unhappy. Marx's solution to that problem was, I think, a good example of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But he was very, very, very perceptive in noting that, this is the central problem with capitalism, is that not everyone is going to get as rich as they think they should, or you might think is fair, right? And dealing with that, nobody's ever dealt with that. We still have problems with that today. Another problem that's especially going to be unique to America is the development of companies, businesses, that are so big they dwarf anything anybody has seen. If you go back to the 16, 17, 1500s, whatever, you had companies before. The first major corporation that was ever created was the British East India Company. It was created to exploit India, and later became, among other things, a private army and a drug cartel. But that was a very big company by the standards of the time. But other than that, most companies got to be very small. This is a day and age before things like the telephone, before things like computers or anything. It was hard for a company to be able to be cohesive over a very long distance. Most businesses tended to be pretty small, family firms, right? In the 19th century United States, essentially Americans invent big business. And the scope of these businesses is so huge, people can't even understand how they got this big or how they would do this. But also, our government and our society are not quite really sort of set up, or no one really thought that this would ever be a thing that would happen. There are very big consequences. A business that the size of, for example, the J.P. Morgan's bank or Rockefeller's oil company is huge. It's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. What do you do when people like that have enormous amounts of money to throw around to get what they want, to destroy the political system, to interfere with the legal system, to hire enormous amounts of workers, right? It's one thing to say that your boss stinks if he hires 3 people. It's like, well, quit and find another job. What about if you live in a city where the primary employer is